Paige, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Jeff. I'm doing well. How are you?
Awesome. Awesome. It's so great to see you.
I know, likewise. Always nice to connect
I
on
mean, see
Zoom.
you over Zoom.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So we only have a half hour, but I always think it's helpful to jump in and give people a little bit of your background. Maybe just where you grew up, what you're all about, and then I've got lots of questions for you. But give folks a little bit of
Okay,
your background. Yeah.
sure. My name is Paige Doherty. I grew up in San Diego. My mom is an artist, you can see in the back. My dad's an engineer. I've always been really interested in that intersection of art and technology. That led me to building a community online focused around venture, writing this book, Seed to Harvest, with my younger brother, and launching Behind Genius Ventures, which is an early stage venture firm. And yeah, I'm just like really passionate about venture and making sure it's more transparent so more folks can get involved.
So I think, a lot of folks get excited about a lot of different ideas when they're in college or coming out of college. Was it something in your family upbringing or somebody that inspired you in college? What caused you at such an early age to jump out and want to do your own thing really right out of the gate? I don't even know. Did you do something in between college and starting Behind Genius?
This is funny. I was just talking with one of the students in like the venture class at SUSU that I like co-teach, and she has like the same mentor that I do, who is at the entrepreneurship center. And I remember he sat me down my junior year and he was like, Paige, you're like a mile wide and an inch deep. Like you got to find like your T, what you want to go deep on. I was like, I'm working on it. I'm working on it. And that was like really what college was all about for me, was finding out what I didn't want to do. I started in the corporate world pretty early. So I was at Northrop Grumman when I was 17, top secret clearance, very like large and bureaucratic organization, but also
This
like
was
a lot
like
of
this was an
support.
internship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So I
Wow.
worked full time there during the summers and then part time during school. I basically like put myself through school, and I joke that I got into venture because managing rappers didn't work out. I was like always at music shows. I like didn't have a ton of money. So I figured out if I cold emailed managers and was like, hey, can I interview your artist and shoot the show? Then they would let me come for free. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. So I did that a bunch. My favorite thing to come out of that was like I had all of these really interesting conversations with creative people. And then I started having the same with founders, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. Like, I want to help these people carry out these big creative visions and help them on their like world changing goals with the small bits that I can, either connecting them with people or helping them with like their marketing and content strategies, which is what I enjoy doing.
And
Yeah.
were these things that you started working on while you were at San Diego State, or did you wait till you were
Mhm.
done? Tell us a little bit how you did it. How did you manage classes and swing all these interests? And by the way, my oldest daughter is applying to colleges now, so I'm sort of like thinking about what is she going to be doing for the next 4 years in addition to going to class. So how did you balance it?
Yeah. I think it's less about balancing and definitely much more about juggling. You kind of have like the balls up in the air, and at one point there's one that's the lowest, and that's the one that you have to handle at all times. I don't think there's ever a point where I was like balancing everything super well. Um, but I was like working to pay for what I was doing. So it was that was kind of like crucial in my journey. I tried to have the things that I was working on be aligned with what I wanted to do later on and like figure out what I did and didn't want to do. So I got into venture my junior year through my entrepreneurship program, the Lab and Entrepreneurship Program at SDSU. And my mentor, Bernie Schroeder, introduced me to the venture capital investment competition team. And then I binge watched all of the seasons of Silicon Valley, like over winter break.
Was that
And
good training or bad?
it was awesome. Well, I think it's satirical, but I think there's like a lot of reality in it, which
Yeah.
I think is funny. But what it showed me is that young women can be venture capitalists. So I didn't really see that as an identity that I could identify with. I thought it was a bunch of old dudes like in a mahogany library smoking cigars and like picking companies. I never thought it was like a career that I could pursue. But after that, I was like, oh, this combines like all of like the intersections of like art and technology and finance and like all of the nuances of building businesses. And so ended up taking second place in the national champs at that venture capital competition and at Google in 2019.
So was this a pitch or what, how did it work?
It's, you basically imitate going through an intro pitch, a due diligence meeting, and then a partner meeting. And we were presenting to around 20 venture capitalists that all worked like in Silicon Valley. And I remember being in the partner meeting and they were like hitting us with all of these questions. And I just loved being in that action, and that energy was so invigorating. And from there, I was completely captivated. So I started looking for opportunities. There wasn't much in San Diego, but actually someone ended up reaching out to me on LinkedIn and was like, hey, I saw that you did the same competition that I did when I did my MBA, and it was really helpful and like trained me a lot on venture. And his name was Michael Sprinkles, and like spelled Mykel Sprinkles. And I was like, this has got to be like a joke message. But it wasn't. And Michael's a partner at TVC Capital, which is one of the largest growth equity firms in San Diego, manage about 400 million, and invest in like growing B2B SaaS companies. And so I cut my teeth kind of on the outskirts of venture. So it's a very different investing philosophy, much more quantitative. I think it gave me a really great background. So I worked there my junior summer and then through senior year. And then I started kind of like looking into opportunities after that. And then COVID hit. So it was a whirlwind of college experience for sure.
So that was your senior year was 1920?
Yes.
Yeah.
1920. I graduated in 20.
Yeah. And so you graduate, and what's next? How did you come to start behind? I mean, you wrote a book and started Behind Genius Ventures. So tell us a little about how those two came to be.
Mm-hmm. So I'll preface this with like, I was looking for other opportunities in the venture world, but family is a really important value to me. I ended up turning down a partner track role in Boston to stay with my family in San Diego. And after that, I was a bit discouraged. There wasn't a ton of opportunity in terms of firms that I could work for that were doing like early stage deals in a Silicon Valley style, which is what I wanted to do. So I just started writing online about my love for venture. I wrote a bunch of threads on term sheets and legal things, and basically all that you could want to know as either an aspiring investor or an operator or a founder who's looking for venture. I think it's really important to understand the incentive alignments behind all of those things. I think they've been opaque for a long time. Mm-hmm. Frankly, like it takes a lot of time to write these things, and I get why other people in the industry haven't written them. But after that point, I started to like grow a community on Twitter. And then my parents would just hear me like geeking out at the dinner table about all this venture stuff. And they're like, what's going on? Like, we don't understand what you're talking about. And I was like, okay, wait, like I'll like draw some diagrams. I love doodling. So I was like doodling all these different diagrams. And I tweeted some of the diagrams, and some people like recommended that I like expand that. And then my friend Nikhil started writing an illustrated children's book about medical trials. And I was like, oh, I love this medium. Like, I think to explain anything well, you have to explain it to the level where a child would understand. So I started drafting Seed to Harvest when I was working full-time at a startup called WorkOS. I was there for about a year as a developer success engineer and doing leading syndicate deals and writing Seed to Harvest for my nights and weekends. And I just remember I would like get done with work. I'd, have like 4 or 5 demo calls that's super deep in the technical weeds of single sign-on. And then I would log off and get to work on my book. And I would just sit in my apartment with like a glass of wine and a clipboard and like a pen and pencil and just like doodle out like, here's what a capital call is. Like, here's like an American versus European waterfall and distributions. And I settled on the analogy of the farmers based on a dream that I had, because I was supposed to send out like a first draft of this book and I had written exactly 0 pages of it. And I was like, I gotta send it out.
But
yeah.
kind of assignment. Yeah.
Yeah. Woke up, had the dream, and at 3 a.m. I started writing, and by 7 a.m. I had written 10 pages with doodles, and I sent it out and got feedback from like 100 people, like including like my mom, young kids, other investors. And so that was really helpful to like have that feedback cycle.
And so I mean, you took the leap and decided to create your own venture firm, right? A lot of people would sort of assume, oh, gee, I should probably go, work at a startup or work at an investment bank or work at a venture firm. I mean, I get a lot of people coming out of college who call me and ask me for career advice.
Mhm.
And, a lot of times I tell them, go do one of those things, go get some experience in one of these fields. You obviously had already done an internship. You'd worked at Northrop Grumman, you'd worked for a venture firm. What kind of got you over the hump and said, you know what, I'm just going to start my own?
This is a really interesting question. I think one of our other investors, Heather Harnett, just published a great article in Forbes on the benefits and pros and cons of starting your own venture firm versus joining another firm. I think when I was making my decision, I had a 10-year timeline. I was like, I want to start a venture firm in the next 10 years. And I said that when I was 19. My timeline just happened to
I happen
accordion
to be
close
22.
much faster than I anticipated. But that was my goal since 19. I like written it down. I was like, here's how I'm going to do it, like create content, build a community. And have been executing on that playbook ever since. It was actually meeting my partner, Josh, that gave me the confidence to go out and start my fund. I think he was the first person that I met with that was like on the level of execution that I was like leading deals and like allocating checks, and have the same intellectual hunger for venture that I did. And he got introduced to me by someone who's now an LP in our fund, which I think is a really cool story, over Twitter. And we had like our first call, and I remember coming out of it and being like, whoa, like I know I'm gonna like work with this guy in some fashion in the future. Like we just like really clicked. And that was in November of 2020. In December of 2020, we got together and sat like 6 feet apart, masked in Laguna, and went through like all the things that we wanted to build, like a decade defining venture firm, because that was very top of our minds. So we wanted to build a firm and be very strategic about building it for the long term versus just doing a fund and that being it. So yeah, and then it's been a pretty crazy journey since then. You've been privy to some of the inside workings of that. But I feel really lucky to be in this position. I think I would encourage young people to own their perspective. And not just young people, like people that have come from a background that they don't think fits the traditional like venture mold of having gone through like investment banking, growth equity, like smaller growth equity, and then going like venture and then earlier stage venture. I think it was a very common path that I saw. And I think the hardest switch becoming an investor is never writing your first check. It's always about that identity switch of like,
Right.
I'm an investor now, regardless of whether I've written a check or not. That's how I evaluate the world and how I want to think about how I'm carrying myself. So I think once I made that switch, I was pretty confident in my decision to build my own firm and then write transparently about what the process has been like. So I'm excited to do more of that, because I think there's definitely pros and cons to doing it. But I was like, I want to stay in San Diego. I want to be with my family.
Create your own destiny. No, I love it. It's, I mean, I always tell people when they think about starting a company or being an entrepreneur, it's a snowball, right? If you get the ball rolling and you persevere and you're hungry and you do the right thing, you will meet people that will open doors, and the snowball will grow and new things will come your way that you didn't anticipate. And you don't always know where that journey's going, but it's been fun to watch. I guess, if you sort of think about the landscape of venture and tech and everything that's going on, how do you think about maybe the advantages that you have? Because I would argue that there are some advantages to being 22, first time fund. A lot of folks who are further along in their career maybe can't take some of the kinds of risks that you can. But I'd love to hear some of the things that you're excited about in the technology universe, and maybe where you think maybe you and other folks have, in your demographic might have an advantage in investing versus people that have been doing it at 20 years and are on fund 18 of, whatever white shoe private equity or venture capital firm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been really interesting to kind of grow up in this community of extremely online people who come from everywhere, not even the US, all over the world, who are thinking intentionally about how they want to invest and carve their legacy out in venture. I think that there's also been a trend of the democratization of investing and also the fractionalization of different assets that allows people to capitalize on their social capital that they built online communities for. So what I've been seeing is a lot more people starting syndicates, starting funds like earlier and earlier. There's now platforms like AngelList and Assure and Carta that allow you to make that process really simple and much less like upfront legal costs. Talking to some of our investors, it used to cost like upwards of $30K to spin up a single SPV and like do all of the legal work for it. But now you can do it for like $6,000, and that cost is passed on. So I think it's gotten a lot more accessible for people to start deploying capital, even if they don't come from generational wealth, based on the syndicate structure and talking about it more publicly. And then in terms of being in this demographic, I think the moniker of Gen Z VC gets thrown around a lot. And my friend Megan Loyce has created an incredible community around that. There's like 11,000 people who are part of the movement. And I think it's really powerful to see more people coming into their own. I can't change the fact that I'm 23. I'm going to get older. I'm not always going to be this age. I think that it's important to find the secret sauce outside of that demographic. But I do think that it allows us really interesting perspective in terms of like, I grew up digitally native. 3/4 of my best friends are people I met online and I've never met in person. And I think we experience time a bit differently than previous generations because everything's so present and available that I feel like we've become more future oriented. So like always thinking about the future, what is it going to look like? And I'm experiencing that shift in real time rather than asking my kids or like my younger friends, like what's going on. I talk to my like 18-year-old brother about it all the time. Like him and his friends only communicate on Snapchat, and like it just changes so quickly. So I feel like it's hard to keep up with that change and be incentivized to keep up with it unless it's part of your life, which it very much is to us. So I think I would dig into putting the hat on of taking the anthropological view sometimes and just be like, this is really interesting. Like, why do people our age do this? Or like, how is it different than how other people do it? Yeah.
I think there's a massive opportunity there, right? And I think historically, the venture universe thought of folks in their teens and early 20s as a demographic that wasn't particularly lucrative to target for consumer technology companies. And I think that's changed a lot, right? I look at the spending power of my kids who order on Amazon. I was driving my daughter to school today and I said, "Hey, did you eat anything?" She said, "No, I'll probably just DoorDash something." And my first thought is like, oh my God, we got to look at the DoorDash budget. Like, that's just such a native thing. So I do think there's a huge advantage there. And I think there's a whole generation of people coming up that have grown up in, very digitally native in gaming and digital payments. And, people talk about the metaverse and I'm like, well, my son lives in the metaverse. Like that is, you can call it whatever you want, but that's where he lives. And so I think there are a lot of advantages there. There are going to be a lot of companies that come along that are pretty exciting, that are taking advantage of that you and other folks are going to have a first crack at. What are if you were to highlight some of the things that you've gotten excited about over the last 6 months, or things that you think you will be excited about in the next 6 months? What are some of the trends or themes that you're like, oh my gosh, I can tell you what mine are. Like, we have to put as much money into these ideas as we can, but I'd love to hear what yours are.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear more about yours. I think some of the main things, so we invest in product-led growth companies at the future of work and the future of play. So these often take the form of companies that have formed around different online communities. I think a really interesting broader theme that we're interested in is the creator economy. And this is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but I think that because of the shift of retirements not being tied to different companies, we don't have pensions anymore. You can roll your 401k over from whatever company you're working at. Now the ability to be an entrepreneur as a career is growing. And I think being a creator is a very public and exciting route of being an entrepreneur. I think that, 2/3 of kids want to be a YouTuber when they grow up. So looking at tools in that space has been really interesting, especially given the perspective of I view myself as a creator, having been writing online for a long time. So my first syndicate investment that I made was in a company called Palette, and it's a community-oriented job board. And I think that they've done some really interesting things around decomposing the hypotheses around how creators have been able to monetize in the past. And it's a definite struggle in that you build an online community that's really engaged, and then you're kind of at a point where you're like, ooh, how do I ask them for money? Because this is getting to be a very time intensive thing. And I know that it's valuable to people, but I don't know how it's valued. And so for them to take it to the point where, it's like, hey, you've gathered a lot of really incredible people in this community. And then we've created a really simple way for companies to post jobs and you to share that to your niche communities. That's been really interesting. And then the broader theme that we're looking into is Web3 and crypto. I went down the crypto rabbit hole for a couple months ago. Yeah. Had a one weekend where I was just on Discord servers and YouTube, and I was deep in it. And I felt the same spark that I had felt when I got into venture the first time, that there was just so much. This is tangential, but I think of mushrooms as the immune system of the world. And a big part of what they do is decay. And I think that this can be taken as a negative, but I think it is net positive because it allows other things to grow from the raw materials. I think crypto has had a very similar role in decomposing all of the assumptions that we made about how businesses are run, how consumers are incentivized, and creating those from scratch of the raw materials. And I've been really excited by that. We made one investment in the Web3 space, a company called Matrix. It's oriented towards gaming creators, and have been really impressed by the team there. But I'm excited to focus more on that space. To anyone listening that's interested in also going down the crypto rabbit hole, my friend Gabby Goldberg writes some really great online pieces about crypto.
I do think your point, sort of how you got to where you are by putting content out there. One of the pieces of advice I give a lot of folks coming out of school is just get passionate about something and write about it. And you'll be amazed how people coalesce around your ideas, right? It's sort of in the old days, you used to have to go speak at a conference if you wanted people to sort of believe in what you were saying. Now you can just put it out there, and there's so much energy behind ideas and people who have ideas. And one of the things I love about crypto is, like you said, the whole DeFi space, how do we take all the motivations and the way our financial system work and break it down to its atomic element and rebuild it from scratch? There's so much opportunity there. It's going to be super cool. What about, have you been in situations where you're in competitive deals and you're trying to win an allocation for you and your fund? And if so, how do you do that? Because that's one of the things I think a lot of people don't understand about venture is that a lot of what we do is sales, right? A lot of it's selling you and your superpowers to entrepreneurs. How do you think about that? And has it come into play for you yet?
That's funny. We're actually in the middle of one right now. I think that it's really interesting to look. There's kind of this bucket, as we see it, of doing consensus deals and then doing non-consensus deals. We really love to be in deals where we're one of the earliest checks in. We get to share with all of our co-investors, but we also enjoy taking part in competitive deal processes. I think for a lot of founders, it's nice to look across the table and see their peers sitting on the other side. I was talking with one of my friends at the Forbes Under 30 Summit last week about it. And I was like, what do you want as a founder from your investors? And he gave me a list of 5 things. So I've kind of been thinking about this more deeply. So the first two are just like not doing things. So one is like not getting in the way. And then two is not offering advice. I think that one of the tenets of nonviolent communication is that you have to ask when someone's explaining a problem to you, like, do you want me to listen to you and comfort you? Or do you want to like have solutions, and do you want me to help you brainstorm? Because I think people can really over-index on, I've definitely been guilty of this at certain times, like over-index on problem solving. And a lot of the time it's really important for people just to have someone that they can go to and be like, yeah, this is really hard. This is a hard problem. Like, I'm here for you and supportive. And I think being a young person in this industry, having a great level of humility about the things I don't know comes more naturally to me than I think some people that might have like years and years of experience. And then the other three things were, one is like validation. So I think that's something that we might have in the longer term in terms of like building a larger fund with more brand name recognition. So I don't think we're there quite yet. The second thing is network, which I think we have in spades. We've kind of over-indexed on that side of things. So in terms of like having 20 plus GPs as our LPs, and working with a group of, 50 to 100 firms on sharing deal flow that we think is really specific to them. So fundraising is one of the things that we feel most equipped to help with, just because we had to build those networks from scratch. And then the third thing was be a cheerleader. I think my mom has always been my biggest cheerleader, so I've learned a lot about how to be a good cheerleader from her. So just like sending encouraging messages to the founders that we work with has been great. But yeah, and then also just having people be like, hey, like we talked to this founder, like, would you mind dropping them like a nice note about us? I sent out about like 7 or 8 of those messages yesterday.
Wow.
So yeah.
That's cool. Well, your point about listening versus providing answers is that is a superpower that a lot of us struggle with. I know I do many times, not just in professional life, but also in personal relationships.
Yeah.
And learn that at an early age. Whew. That's a hard one.
I haven't like totally learned it yet, but it's something I'm like trying to be more conscious of.
Yeah. I mean, particularly when you're a founder, I mean, a lot of times the founders have better ideas as to what the answers are than the board does.
Oh yeah.
So they're just looking for people to be a sounding board, not give them the answer. So that's amazing. What about, I guess going back to kind of the idea that, maybe what you're doing is pretty cool, coming right out of college and jumping into what you're doing. What advice would you have for folks who are in college and want to go into startups, venture capital? I mean, you obviously had this journey of sort of learning what the industry was and how it worked, and then you created your own content around it. That was a great path. Are there other things that you see people at San Diego State or elsewhere doing that you're inspired by? Kind of a random question. I just as you look around, I mean, you're swimming in a universe of people that are doing really cool stuff. And I think, there's this sort of like generational mantra of like, oh, life is harder today than it was when we were kids. And I just think I'm a hammer looking for nails. I'm very optimistic about the future, but I look at the opportunities for folks coming out of college or out of business school or out of their first job. There's never been a better time to create content, to be a creator, to invest in things like crypto, to be a startup founder. Mm-hmm. I don't, that could end. I mean, we've certainly been through really tough economic cycles, but if the current momentum behind that kind of mantra continues, it's going to be a lot of fun for the next 3 to 5 years. Are there other things that you see people doing or would encourage people to do that you're excited about?
So I love this question because being in one of the most frothy periods, arguably ever, of the capital markets has been such a hilarious time to enter into the world of venture, because everyone's like, the pace is so fast. And I'm looking around, I'm like, what do you mean? Like, this is normal. We don't know anything else. And so I think you're going to have a generation of people that are very optimistic about the innovation in tech. I would encourage people to like, joking with my friend about this, like automate everything but vibes. Like, I think a lot of people take themselves very seriously. Like in school, you're like, okay, cool. Here's how to like write a letter to someone. It's like, dear Mrs. Doherty, like date on the top, address, like long thing. And I think that there's something to be said for like being more informal in your communication. And I don't know if this was like naivety or what, but I would just DM people and I was like early on and be like, yo, really love this piece of writing. Like, what do you think about like this one? And just having like a level of informality where you create yourself on a much more like equal playing field than you do if you write like a very formalized cover letter, etc. So just like finding places where you feel comfortable being more informal. I remember being on Clubhouse like really early and people would be like, why do you sound so presidential? And then I was like, oh, that's right. Like I need to just like chill out and have more fun. Like that's the point. I think viewing work as play has made this journey so much more enjoyable. So I'd encourage young people to have a sense of play when they're building communities online and go down those rabbit holes and find things you're passionate about and like be a noob. Like you only get to be a noob once in whatever you're doing. So write about it too. I think that's like the beginner's mind is so valuable and people undervalue it. They're like, I don't know anything. I'm like, awesome. Like, tell me about that. What is like tripping you up? What are you learning about? What are you excited about? You don't get that like raw mind very long.
And the ability to come out of school and spend time on things you want to spend time on. I mean, for many generations, the mantra was you came out and got a job that maybe didn't love, but you had to do it for 5 to 10 years. I just love the idea that folks are coming right out of college, starting companies, investing. I'm super bullish. I think the next few years are going to be super cool.
Yeah. Me
Well,
too.
look, I'm thrilled to see you doing all the cool things you're doing. I think I'm super excited for you and the firm, and it's going to be fun to watch. So thanks for spending some time with us.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. This was a pleasure. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right, Paige, take care.
All right. Bye.